Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Eduard's unboxing of the Bf109F-2. This is the first Bf109 that I've done on the channel, so let's see how I get on. So then, to kickstart my first ever Bf109 build, we are going to be looking at the cockpit. Specifically, as you can see on screen, I'm just securing the trim wheels into place, and then the back wall or back plate, I guess, to the seat is also being secured on next. I then went on to make the foolish decision to insert the control column at this point in the build. I pinged this off while building up the cockpit about 12 times to my counting, so I potentially in the next build I'm going to leave that until a little bit later. Turning our attention to the rudder pedals, you'll see that they're actually made of plastic. Although this is a Profi pack, I chose not to use that much of the photo etch. The reason behind this is because a lot of these parts I thought weren't going to make a huge noticeable difference to the build, so I thought I'd go along with the plastic ones instead. I'm personally not a huge fan of using photo etch just because you can use photo etch. That being said, when I do see that there's an obvious upgrade over the plastic parts, I won't hesitate to use it. Bringing our focus now back to the build at hand, you could see that I was just building up the sidewalls of the fuselage before we can go on to the first bit of paint. The first bit of paint going down onto this build is going to be Mr. Hobby's rendition of RLM 66, which is a very nice looking dark grey. This was thinned down in the ratio of 50-50 and sprayed down at around about 1 bar or 15 to 16 psi. No funky painting methods here either, I'm just trying to get a nice uniform coat which will give me a really nice base to do some detail painting. To do some detail painting I'm going to be really just using black, reds, yellows and a couple of whites. To do all of this detail painting I'm going to be using the Ammo Mig variant of paints. The reason behind this is because they're water-based acrylics which make them a hell of a lot more fun to brush paint with compared to lacquers. Now that all of those lovely details are popping, I can do a little bit more assembly. Specifically, as you can see on screen, I'm just putting the bottom half of the seat into place. So I'm not too sure if you agree with me, but I think that cockpit looks just a little bit too pristine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of an oil brusher, specifically the dust colour, to busy it up a little bit. I personally didn't want to do anything too extreme here, so using a dust colour just to replicate a little bit of dust buildup, as I'm using dust in the bottom of the cockpit, was I think exactly what this cockpit needed. Something that I was trying out on this build was creating a worn looked effect on the seat. What I mean by this is I wanted to do or convey a sort of chipping effect without chipping and without using metallic or any other paints. What I did was I used the oil brusher again, let it dry a little bit so it becomes a little bit tacky, and then used a stiff headed brush and then just tried to almost stipple it and push it outwards. It kind of gave this quite nicely worn looking effect. I really liked it and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be using it in the future. Do let me know what you personally think of it, as it's always great to have multiple opinions, but I think I'm onto a winner here. Now, to really sell that dusty effect and bring everything together, I'm going to use a very unknown substance. Dust. All jokes aside, I'm just going to be using some pigments here to add another level of dimension to this dusty effect and really start to bring everything together. Once I'm happy with the general feel of the cockpit, I can start to use a little bit of the photo etch. You might notice that there's only 2 of the 4 seatbelts here, and that is because I lost the photo etch fret. Woohoo! Yeah, pro modeler. Luckily, I did have another Bf109 in my stash, so I did just steal 2 of the seatbelts from that, but I couldn't find the other ones. So just don't look into the cockpit, head down. Thank you very much, guys. With my utter stupidity out of the way, hopefully for the last time in this build, I can go on to do a few more assemblies. Specifically, you can see on screen, I'm putting the exhaust stacks in place. I don't know if I'm a huge fan of having to put the exhaust stacks in at this part of the build, from the inside out, as per se, just because it meant that they had to be hand painted later, and I would have preferred to potentially use my airbrush to get some more of that sort of sooty effect on them, but I will have to make do. The 2 fuselage halves can now in fact come together. The fit here is very, very nice indeed, and I did actually have to make sure not to get rid of the seam on the rear half of the spine of the Bf109, let's say, because it is actually meant to be there. I was almost on autopilot, and I'm sure many other modelers fall into the same sort of mistake, where you're so used to clearing up seams that you kind of go overboard and get rid of seams which should be there. Now moving our attention to the rear of the aircraft, we can now look to build up the vertical and also the horizontal stabilizers. All parts at this portion of the build have some really nice slotting and interlocking mechanisms which make sure you have a really good connection between the parts. The only downside to this is in fact that you can't really make many of the control surfaces movable, but for me personally I'm not too fussed. I'd rather have a secure fit and control surfaces which are in a maybe not as realistic position than movable ones which fall off whenever the wind blows. The underwing gear bay is also built up at this stage, has some really nice slotting mechanisms which click into place in almost a Tamiya-esque way. Very, very impressive indeed. That can now be sandwiched in between the upper and lower half of the wing. Once again, a very nice fit here. Only needed to be the leading edges had to be blended in using a sanding stick, but that is something which comes with every kit. The fuselage to wing root join was actually, in my opinion, very good, or at least it was ample. I think if it was any bigger I would have had to fill it, but I was happy enough to take the risk that it will be okay. The leading edge slats can also be put into place here. It's nice to see that they are moulded in a way that they're already extended, as I'm pretty sure, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but the leading edge slats were spring loaded, so whenever there wasn't sufficient airflow going over them, they would be drooping out. Continuing our attention and focus on the wings, I'm going to continue now and put on the ailerons along with the flaps and also the radiator flaps, I think they're called, or don't know, radiators. I unfortunately did lose a little bit of footage from the radiator build up, however they went together flawlessly. You know, I have nothing bad to really report about this kit. It was just joyful to put together. I mean, it went together so quickly as well. I think I got it from Hannant's on the Sunday, I think, and it's been finished and it's Saturday night. It's great. So the cockpit can in fact now be closed up, however not completely. As you can see, the headrest which sits inside the main sort of portion of the canopy did not have the best fit. As I leave it here, you'll see that it droops down, so I was very, very happy that I didn't permanently cement it in place, and that remains on to this very day. So in the final photos you might see that there's a small gap between the fuselage and the canopy, and that is purely because I don't want to completely cement this canopy down, just in case over time that starts to droop and it will piss me off so much if I can't get to it. So if you see a gap, you didn't see it. I can now use the kit supplied masks, which funnily enough I didn't lose this time, to mask off all the canopy really nicely. I can then spray down some RLM 66 to represent the framing colour, and really we were ready to go on to primer. If this isn't your first time watching the channel, you will be familiar that I've really been enjoying using the spray can versions of Mr. Hobby products. Up until now I've only been using the varnishes, but now we're going to be trying out the Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500. I've had many people ask me where do I get the aerosol versions of these products from, and the answer to this is Hannant's in London. Hannant's London supplies a full range of Mr. Hobby products, from liquid mask to decal setters, and as you can see I'm using here the aerosol variant of their products. But it doesn't just stop at Mr. Hobby. Their selection of kits is incredibly extensive, so I'm definitely willing to say that there will be a project in there for you. Their details are on screen now, so if you're in the area potentially visiting the RAF museum next door, be sure to pop on over and say hi. The one thing that I would say about those aerosols is, my goodness, they are messy. They go absolutely everywhere, but what an incredibly good finish they give, and it gave me a great base for Mr. Colour's C117, which is that lovely blue colour. It can then be masked off with a hell of a lot of Tamiya's masking tape before the next two colours can be sprayed down. When I'm talking about spraying ratios, I briefly touched on it earlier. It's going to be a 50-50 mix and spraying at 1 bar. The next colour to go down is Mr. Colour's C37, which is an RLM 75 grey violet-y sort of colour. When I was spraying this down, all I was aiming for is to get a really nice uniform finish, which can then be later modulated if I feel fit. That being said, in recent builds I'm really enjoying having not clean but more crisply painted builds. I think the effect it gives is just a little bit better than what the builds were looking like about a year ago. Once I was happy with how that was looking, I could then mask off the required areas and spray down a C36, which is RLM 74. To mask everything off, I'm going to be using a combination of Amomig's masking putty and also Tamiya's masking tape for the really harsh lines of the splinter camouflage. When it comes to what airbrush I'm using to do this basic painting, I'm actually using the Gallery airbrush. So I did touch on the topic in last week's video, which was the F16 Aggressor Adversary Viper video. If you haven't watched that, be sure to go and watch it. And honestly, nothing's changed. I feel the exact same as I did. So this is now 2 builds, and I still feel that it's, you know, it's an acceptable brush at an okay price, but I feel happier with slightly more expensive brushes in my hand. They just seem to, you know, suit my hand shape better. I have expensive hands, what can I say? So it seems to me that I might have got a little bit trigger happy when painting that RLM 74, as I was left with a ridge between the 2 colours. To rectify this issue, all I did was get out Amomig sanding sponge and use step 4, which is about 1500 grit, and passed over it about 2 or 3 times. I made sure not to over sand it, purely because I know lacquers are, you know, quite tough, but they're not exceptionally tough, and I didn't want to risk going through and potentially altering the tone and colour of the paint around it. With the basic shades all sprayed down, I could then go on to the more complicated parts of this scheme, and for that I'm bringing out the Procon Boy. Not too sure why I said it like that, maybe I was just trying to make it a little bit more dramatic, but the reason for me using the Procon Boy is the fact that it is such a fine line brush that it would definitely allow me to replicate that model to a relatively good extent. Unfortunately, not a huge amount of footage was recorded of me mottling, and I'm going to put that down to the fact that I have to look through my phone when I'm recording, and the phone is about 5 inches by 2 inches, so it's not a huge screen, and I really wanted to make sure that this was the best of my abilities. The issue which I did encounter was, as you can see, the paint flow isn't incredibly smooth. It doesn't output a smooth line, and the reason for this is because I didn't have a smooth enough motion when I was painting. I would like kind of go forward jut and go forward jut, you know, and all this sort of stuff, which kind of gave a little bit of a patchy output. And the more mottling which I did, the more I evolved to kind of increase the flow of my build. I think at the beginning I was so focused on trying to do it exactly how the paint scheme wants it, and the further on the build I went, the more I realised that if I want this paint job to look good, I'm going to have to probably make 1 or 2 inaccuracies with the scheme, but it's a small price to pay. Do let me know what you think. I think it was the right decision to potentially alter a little bit away from accuracy for a little bit more of a fluid paint job. Once that initial RLM 74 had been sprayed down, I can spray down the grey violet colour. This was a little bit easier to film as it's just kind of big blobs all over the place. Still definitely required some accuracy, but I really enjoyed painting this scheme. It was a really good challenge for me. I'd say my most challenging to date. Well, maybe the Viper was a little bit more challenging. The 30-second Viper from back last year. If you know it, you know it. But this one was still a lot of fun. I really do enjoy doing these Luftwaffe schemes. This is, I think, the 3rd or 4th which I've done. However, I think there's going to be plenty more coming to this channel in 2024. Something that I did off camera after taking a little bit of time to reflect on the scheme was I actually repainted, well, not repainted, but I went over the RLM 74 aspects of the model just to try and make it a little bit more fluid and a little bit more solid as a colour. So hopefully you see that in the final shots, and yeah, really I was quite happy with how it turned out in the end, but definitely a challenge. Back to some more basic painting now. This time I'm just going to be picking out a couple of elements which have to be sprayed in RLM 04. I think this, it brought the build together for me. I remember putting it down after peeling this off and actually physically clapping and feeling myself giggle a little bit like a little girl. Yeah, modelling, what an interesting hobby. But anyway, that was the scheme pretty much complete, and I can now seal in all of my hard work using another spray can, but this time it's a semi-gloss. All of the decals can then be applied, and they went down really nicely. I used Mr. Mark Softer and Setter, and as you can see by my excited little hands, I was rather impressed by the results. You could even see some of the rivets under the decals, which is quite rare for me. Speaking of decals, there is a certain decal which was applied on the rear of the aircraft. Mac Models as a channel has no affiliation to this symbol whatsoever. It is just on the aircraft for historical accuracy. If you are in fact offended by this, I urge you to click off the video now, as it will be displayed quite a bit more. When it comes to weathering the Bf109, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but initially what I did do was I tried to use a pin wash to accentuate all the rivet lines, and then it didn't work at all. So I completely let it dry, by the way. It just completely got wiped off. It just must have been a little bit too glossy of a finish. But then I used some matte varnish to secure everything in and give a little bit more grip to the actual paintwork, and then I'm going to use a shader instead to accentuate all of those rivet lines, and that worked really quite nicely. The one thing I would say is the shaders really did not show up against the mottle on the fuselage, but I'm not actually that fussed about that, as there's going to be a different focus point on the fuselage, and that is going to be this exhaust stain. The exhaust stain was mixed up using quite a few different colours actually, some greys, some just a basic black, and also a couple of drops of brown. The brown just gives the exhaust stain a little bit of warmth to it and makes it less look like a big black streak and more like a city and warmy sort of effect. That was sprayed down using my Pro Convoy again, and it was also a heavily diluted solution which was built up over a majority of passes. And really, we are now onto the home straight of this build. The final bits and bobs can be cemented on, including the spinner, as you can see on screen, the landing gear legs, which had some really nice secure points, which made me very, very happy. And then, really, it's starting to look like a Bf109. The mask can then be removed to reveal that there unfortunately is some shit under the canopy and onto the glass, but luckily I didn't cement it in place, so that can be removed and cleaned off. And that is this build finished. So I'd like to take a moment to say a big thank you for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it and at least got something out of it. Do let me know what you think of this down below in the comments, whether you like it, you hate it, or you want to see me do more of it or less of it. Do just let me know. I always like to hear from you guys. Anyway, without any further ado, this was my take on Eduard's Bf109F-2. Enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.